Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Here's your host, Garry Pierre-Pierre.
Welcome to the show. Every week between now and November 8th, we will focus on different aspects of this very controversial presidential race. Today, we'll be looking at the issue of police-community relations. Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton says everyone must respect the law, but officers must show respect for the communities they serve. Meanwhile, Republican nominee Donald Trump claims he is the best candidate to restore law and order, accusing his opponent of being against the police. Joining me today to discuss this topic are Professor Monica Varsanyi, political science professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of Policing Immigrants, Local Law Enforcement on the Front Lines, and Professor Alex Vitale, associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Brooklyn College. Welcome.
Thank you.
Given what happened with the bombing incidents in Manhattan and New Jersey, I thought perhaps we should start with that because I think the two issues kind of link, the terrorism and law enforcement and community police relations. Mm-hmm. Well, Donald Trump has said that there will be more attacks. Is he right and why, Professor Vitale?
Well, I think it's likely there will be more attacks. If we just look at what's going on around the world, there is a lot of conflict in European cities. There have been a number of attacks there and other places as well. And of course, the U.S. remains actively involved in combat operations in the Middle East and a variety of places, and this is going to always engender some blowback. The question is really how, as a country, do we respond to these occasional incidents? We also have to keep in mind that the bulk of large-scale violent incidents are committed by Americans that have nothing to do with international issues and are tied to the failures of our mental health system, the widespread availability of assault rifles, and these kinds of things, and right-wing movements in the United States.
So how do we deal with that, Dr. Varsanyi?
Well, one of the major findings of our book was that when police actually have open access to the communities that they serve, you get a much higher degree of public safety. So regardless of who may be committing these sorts of crimes, having interactions with communities is key to community policing and to public safety and positive, productive enforcement. So any kinds of proposals that seek to cut off the connection between police and their communities, and specifically in the terms of our book, we spoke about immigrant communities, is not going to be helpful for public safety in the long run. We need an open communication between all of these different players.
Trump has proposed closing borders and deporting a massive amount of undocumented immigrants. Is that would that work? Would that solve the problem?
Well, it certainly won't solve the risk of terrorism problem because closing the borders is not feasible, it's not doable, it's never been doable. And also, as Monica pointed out, if we want to really be effective in trying to reduce the number and intensity of violent attacks, we need to have cooperation in the communities that these attacks might come out of. And when we criminalize those communities, when we threaten those communities, when we publicly vilify them, those communities will become more closed to law enforcement and we won't get the tips because these tips do happen and they do make a tremendous difference in these law enforcement efforts.
It seems in this election cycle, immigrants are portrayed as criminals and people we need to get rid of. How did we get there?
Well, there's a long, long history going back to the founding of our country that connects immigrants with criminality. People's perception is that immigrants tend to be more criminally inclined. That has been found not to be the case over, through much social science research over decades. That's not the case at all. In fact, immigrants to the United States on the whole are less criminogenic than native-born individuals. So what ends up happening is that immigrant communities tend to actually be safer if you look at sort of rates of crime within those communities. It's only when people, when families are in the United States for multiple generations that they might go more towards the American norm of being, the average criminal rate or what have you. But immigrant communities on the whole are safer than whatever native-born communities.
Policy-wise, what can any of these candidates do when one of them becomes president to really tackle the root cause of this problem? It is a problem, after all.
Well, I think this is a question of international relations as much as anything else. It's not really a question of ultimately of law enforcement. Law enforcement is left to pick up the pieces that basically are being produced by U.S. foreign policy. And that's not my area of expertise, but I think those are where we should be asking a lot of really tough questions.
Dr. Varsanyi, on that note, it's your area of expertise. What do you think?
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, what's happened with law enforcement in the United States, for much of the 20th century, local law enforcement, and by that I mean local police forces and sheriff's departments and so forth, were not remotely involved with immigration enforcement. This is a very recent phenomenon that took place starting sort of in the early 2000s and to the mid 2000s is when local law enforcement got wrapped up into the immigration enforcement issue. So, for much of the 20th century, we were not in a situation where local law enforcement was involved in immigration enforcement at all. And as Alex points out, many of the reasons why we have, immigration flows to the United States have a lot to do with American foreign policy, and also opportunity here in the United States, of course. But that's it's not a local law enforcement issue at some level. And what we found in our research is that local law enforcement, on the whole, does not want to get involved with immigration enforcement. They see it as a directly counter to their mandate as enforcing public safety.
Well, if we remember after the Dallas shootings, the police chief there said, yeah, law enforcement is being asked to do a lot more than it is equipped to do, and it's unfair. So is there a movement to really make sure that, these guys are law enforcement officers, not social workers, and not, there to do anything but to protect and to serve?
I think Chief Brown's statement was incredibly profound and really needs to be looked at closely. The role of police has expanded so dramatically in the last 30, 40 years to cover so many problems in our societies, and they're just not effective in so many of these areas. In fact, they are often counterproductive. The war on drugs, trying to control sex workers, putting more police in schools. These are just a really bad idea. And by turning these problems over to police, we undermine efforts at producing racial justice, economic justice, and we let the rest of government off the hook. And I think that is my concern about both of the presidential candidates, is that they're not zeroing in enough on what Chief Brown said. Clinton has indicated some willingness to look at some social programs, look at some redistributive mechanisms, which is a step in the positive direction. But while Trump has doubled down on this toughen crime talk, he has talked about some child care stuff, minimal as it is. So what we need is to have more movement in that direction to bring back the idea that the state can play a positive role in solving problems, not just by relying on coercion, imprisonment, and violence.
Dr. Varsanyi, you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that thought, we are, at the end of several decades of the increasing criminalization of various sectors of our society. And we are increasingly in this country, and have for a number of decades now, since sort of the 70s and 80s, we deal with social problems as criminal problems. We deal with mental illness as a criminal issue because the police are the first, they're on the front lines of engaging with mentally ill homeless people, for instance. So instead of taking them to a mental health facility, they get put in jail for the night. These kinds of things. So we are definitely we have come to, I'm hoping, the apex of criminalizing all these sorts of things in our society, and hopefully, although I'm not terribly hopeful about this, we'll be moving in a direction of increasingly trying to fund social services for people who really need these kinds of help.
What some of the policies should be of these candidates? You mentioned what they're not saying, but what should they be saying?
Well, let's take the example that Monica just raised, mentally ill homeless people. There's now abundant research that shows that the best policy to use to deal with that is to take a housing first approach, which is to say that homeless people need stable housing with support services. And that is how we take the first step to both treating their mental illness and reducing their impact on communities, which is a legitimate concern for people. We spend at Rikers Island close to $200,000 a year per bed to incarcerate New Yorkers.
$200,000?
That's right. We could be putting people in the Plaza Hotel for cheaper than that.
I'll take a room.
And at least a third of the people at Rikers Island there have a documented significant mental health problem. They should not be at Rikers Island. Neither candidate is talking about that. And that is, my big disappointment is that we need not just to reduce over-aggressive policing, reduce the rate of incarceration. We need to build the community infrastructures so that we don't need the police and prisons to be our problem solvers.
Last week, outgoing former Commissioner William Bratton refused to meet with Donald Trump. He went on and met with Hillary Clinton. So, Dr. Monica Varsanyi, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think a professional law enforcement person refused to meet with the nominee of a major political party for president?
That's interesting. I can't get into his head, but I would assume that it's because Trump's policies are very much counter to the mandate of law enforcement. Again, think about what Trump is proposing. He has a number of immigration proposals, but let's just take a couple of them. One of them is that he wants to deport what are called quote unquote criminal aliens. He wants to deport millions of people who are in the country who have quote unquote committed crimes.
But actually, that number is not in the millions, though. I think there's 80,000 people among the 11 million who have some kind of criminal record.
Well, what ends up happening, this is an interesting thing. Several decades ago, laws were passed that really redefined for immigration purposes what counts as a crime, right? So they're called aggravated felonies. And if somebody is convicted of an aggravated felony, which that sounds like a terrible thing. When you think of what sounds like an aggravated felony, you think, murder, rape, all these things. And those certainly fall into that category. But it's also, for immigration purposes, included things like shoplifting or jumping a turnstile at the subway. So if you're convicted of an quote-unquote an aggravated felony, you are a criminal. You're essentially seen now as a criminal, when in fact something like jumping a turnstile, sure, we shouldn't jump turnstiles at the subway, but you would hardly equate a murderer with somebody who's jumping a turnstile. So anyway, when you have people who are convicted of aggravated felonies, those are the people, including those who've committed much more serious crimes, who are being targeted for deportation. From a law enforcement perspective, in order to actually bring those people into the law enforcement field, you have to get local officers involved. And again, when you get local officers involved in immigration enforcement, it creates a huge chilling effect between communities and police, which police on the whole have noted as being very counterproductive to their mandate.
And let's not forget that so-called illegal entry in and of itself is now a misdemeanor as opposed to a civil violation, and illegal re-entry is now a felony. So in fact, anyone who's here illegally has, in the view of the criminal law, committed a crime. So that does encompass this much larger number of millions potentially.
It does, yeah. So we have, again, I was speaking earlier about the criminalization of many aspects of American society, and this immigration is no less one of these places where increasingly things that you would not think of as being criminal in the feeling of that word are being considered that for immigration purposes and for deportation purposes.
Hillary Clinton's proposals seem to deal with more of the root cause of the problem. She has on her website, take out ISIS stronghold in Iraq and Syria, work with the allies to dismantle global terror networks. I don't see too much about what to do here.
Well, of course, the foreign policy thing might actually be a problem, because it was our military interventions in that region in the first place that to some degree has made us a target of some of these groups. So while I'm sure we're all extremely unhappy about ISIS, their role in the Middle East, the threat they pose here and in Europe, just taking an aggressive, we're going to stomp them out. This is the same neoconservative ideology that says that the solution to every problem is to get tough. And in a way, this is what the two candidates share, is they both really adhere to a broadly neoconservative agenda internationally and domestically. Neither of them is talking about how can we produce a Middle East that is more just, that produces a real livelihood for people, both in the countries that we're allied with and those that we have obvious problems with.
Is this the most contentious we've seen, the community police relations across the country in decades? Is this, it feels like that. My question is it?
Well, certainly then in decades. I mean, we saw similar conversations in the late 60s and early 70s, obviously. So since that period, we haven't had this kind of sustained conversation about policing. It is a real issue. Again, I'm not so happy with the way either candidate is framing it. Trump is trying to say that, again, police can solve all our problems if we just support them and if people just do what they say. Clinton is talking more about trying to create respectful policing, and it's understandable because in communities that have a lot of crime, they want something done about that. And what they've been told over the last 40 years is that the only real resource they can have from the government to deal with their community problems is more police. So they want more police, but they want the police to be nicer. But there's a fundamental contradiction there. If you tell the police to wage a war on crime, a war on drugs, a war on disorder, a war on terrorism, they can't also be officer friendly. And neither candidate's really dealing with that. Instead, what you have from the Clinton administration,
not yet.
Well, what you have from the Clinton campaign is a lot of discussion of what we call procedural justice issues, which is if we could just get the police to be better trained, to follow the law, to not act in a biased fashion, to have some enhanced accountability, that will solve the problem. The problem in my mind with that approach is that a perfectly well-executed marijuana arrest can still ruin someone's life. Without any racial bias, without any brutality, that felony record could be the end of their future. They can't get federal student loans, they can't get public housing, they can't get future employment often.
They can't get into SUNY schools because they're asking about that now?
Well, so this is an issue of substantive justice, and that the Clinton campaign is not addressing.
Dr. Varsanyi, what to Dr. Vitale's point, what can the police do? On the one hand, they're being asked to really kick ass, get on these communities that are drug infested, crime infested, get rid of it. And then, when they do that, then people like us are criticizing them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the magic answer here, obviously, but drawing upon our research, we did find that in general, police forces that moved towards what's called a community policing model were on the whole much more effective than those that didn't. Police forces that maintain kind of a distance from their communities and don't do things like foot patrols or community meetings or those sorts of things are at a great disadvantage when it comes to doing community-friendly law enforcement. So, if we're going to stay within a paradigm that police exist and they're part of our communities and so forth, there's ways to do policing that are much more effective than other ways.
The question I have, Dr. Vitale, is that how much power does the federal government have over this issue?
It is limited. We have around 18,000 separate law enforcement entities in the United States, and only a few of them are federal. Now, this is not to say that the federal government doesn't have any influence. The federal government in the past has used funding programs to mandate changes in how policing is conducted. So for instance, coming out of the periods of civil unrest in the 60s and 70s, they used the Law Enforcement Assistance Association to give out grants, and they tried to put various strings on them, target the grants to move towards things like community policing, but also the creation of SWAT teams and giving them a lot of high-tech gear and then eventually a lot of military gear. So to the extent that the federal government has been an influence on policing, I would say on balance it's been pretty negative. It's actually encouraged a more militarized ethos of policing and a more highly armed form of policing. Now, there is an Office of Community Policing that tries to give out some money to encourage community policing initiatives, but it's not well funded. The records of success with their initiatives are quite limited. And also, it never really gets to these core questions of, is a more efficient and effective war on drugs actually what we need?
Dr. Varsanyi, your thought on that?
I mean, yeah, I can speak to the immigration side of it, which is, you asked how involved the federal government is or how much control they have over these issues.
Yes, exactly. Well, for instance, if you look at New York City, back in the late 80s and early 90s, the federal government under the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, gave a grant to the city that ushered in the Safe Street, Safe City program that many people would say turned around the crime situation in the city. What can something like that be repeated, not only here, but other places where we have serious problems, Chicago being one of them?
Well, I mean, I can speak just from the research that we've done, I can speak to the immigration side of it. And the federal government, what happened over the last sort of 15 years is that the federal government sought to include police forces and sheriff's departments as what they called force multipliers in the war on immigration.
Lots of wars.
What's that?
Lots of wars we fight.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's add another war to the list. But in trying to include local law enforcement as force multipliers, again, we've gotten into this situation where there's sort of multiple problems with that. I've already spoken about the problem with, the chilling effect on community relations between the police and community relations. But one thing that I haven't mentioned is that there's a really wide, and this is something we talk about in the book quite extensively. From the research that we did, there's a very broad patchwork of how these laws are enforced on the ground. So it's one thing to have federal immigration law. It's another thing to have local law enforcement agencies. And as Professor Vitale mentioned, there's thousands of them all trying to implement these policies on the ground. So you have department level implementation differences, so some places that are more gung-ho than others. And then you also have officer level differences. And one of the key tenets of law enforcement is officer discretion. So if you happen to be somewhere where an officer is more gung-ho for immigration enforcement than another, or a department's more gung-ho than another, you have very, very different outcomes. And what we have found across the country is as the federal government has sort of extended its reach down to the local level in immigration enforcement, is you have a very, very uneven patchwork of enforcement policies across the country. So there's not really the ability of the federal government to uniformly extend its immigration desires for enforcement down to the local level. It's just not what's been happening. Let's
switch the conversation to the community side. Nationally, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen the NFL has gotten involved into the fray with a lot of black and other people protesting the abuse of the police. Is this something that should be encouraged by these candidates, or is their posture positive? Is it helping or hurting?
Well, I don't think any candidate is going to actively embrace that kind of a political protest movement. The question is, how are they going to relate to it? So clearly the Trump folks are completely opposed to this, are going to try to marginalize and isolate this, are going to try to use this to further whip up the fear of mostly whites, that their control over the society is coming unglued. So it's going to play, the Trump folks are going to try to play that into a narrative that things are out of control and what you need is a strong father figure to whip everyone into shape. Clinton has been very sophisticated and deft in her handling of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is one area where she far surpassed, I think, what Bernie Sanders was able to do. He was not very nuanced and comfortable in dealing with this. Some of his speeches were disrupted. Clinton was able to talk to these folks and to in a way isolate them so that they were not a threat to her.
Did she
campaign.
co-opt them in a way?
I don't know if she co-opted them, but she handled them. And we have some tapes of some of these conversations. So we could see the deftness of her ability to do that. I mean, she is the consummate professional politician in that regard. Okay. So she is going to relate to those people, but not do anything, I think, super public that would potentially alienate those crossover voters she needs in Pennsylvania, Ohio, et cetera.
Okay. Dr. Varsanyi?
Yeah, I think, President Obama's response to the Dallas shootings was really, I think, a productive one. To echo Alex's what Alex just said. I don't think any of the candidates, I don't think Hillary Clinton is going to say, "Hey, we need to crack down on police brutality and change things." But what President Obama did in the wake of Dallas was he said, "Look, we need to stand together with law enforcement agencies, and as we mentioned earlier in our discussion today, and understand that they're having a wide variety of pressures being placed on them that are things that they shouldn't be doing, like doing social service work and so forth." So he kind of stood firm with the police and also criticized in some ways the systemic move towards the police handling a variety of issues that should not be under their in their bailiwick.
When you look at Hillary, Dr. Vitale, you said she was really deft with the issue. What are her prescriptions for the ongoing problem?
Well, her language around this sounds very similar to what President Obama has said, which is just we hear that there's a problem and we want our police to be, in a sense, more effective. And by effective, we mean better integrated into communities so that police and communities can work together. And that is the kind of classic, what I'll call a liberal prescription for police reform, which is again tied to this notion of procedural justice. Justice comes from enforcing the law equally, respectfully, with good communication, et cetera. But again, it doesn't address at all whether or not those actual laws are just, are producing just outcomes. And that requires a kind of political accountability, not just police accountability. And this is where we don't see a lot of openings on the national stage, certainly not between the two main candidates. We have to look more at what's going on at the local level, races at the state level, which is where most criminal law gets produced, where most policing policy gets set. And so people have to be politically active, not just at the presidential level, but looking at what's going on in all these lower races too.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very good conversation, really enjoyable. Thank you to Dr. Alex Vitale and Dr. Monica Varsanyi for joining us today. From all of us at Independent Sources, see you next week.